Working in perspective in Illustrator is kind of like a whole new ball game. The tools work differently, and just about everything still works in a similar way, but in a slightly different way. To start with, to set this up, you'll open a file. We've used a strong horizontal, and you'll use this tool to get started. As soon as you click here, you'll notice that a grid pops up. Now this grid may look different on yours, or it may look the same, and it is a two-point perspective. If you've ever studied linear perspective, and especially two-point perspective, you'll kind of recognize this as looking at the corner of a cube. It can represent anything, and the cube is adjustable. If I zoom out, I can use this tool, the same tool, the perspective grid tool, to raise and lower my perspective so that the horizon is in a different spot, from a high angle to a low angle. You can also move the vanishing points of your perspective so that you have a wider perspective. So now I'm looking a little bit more at the left side of the cube than at the right. You do the same thing on the right. You can make it wider, you can make it narrower, however you like to do it. It starts off as being sort of even, and you don't have to leave it that way. If you want sometimes a little more dramatic kind of a view, change that. You can also change the top grid so that you have a little lower top on it. And remember, this grid is just a suggestion. It doesn't really matter where you put this so much, because once you start drawing, it's just a reference. Now you also can change the wings of the facets of the perspective this way, and you can bring the left side this way and the right side back over to match it, or the other way if that's what you want to do. Okay, there's also a control down here that will raise and lower the bottom of the perspective. Okay, so again, whatever you decide to draw, and it is going to be totally up to you, whatever you feel like you want to do, from a product, anything that's basically a cube, this will work just fine. And so I'm just going to kind of return it to where it was, and then remind you that it's just the perspective grid tool and the tool under it. Those are our primary tools. The other perspective-friendly tools are the basic shapes, the rectangle, the round corner tool, the ellipse. Okay, you can also use your line segment and your arc and your spiral and the other tools that are next to it there. The pen still functions in this method of drawing. The type tool, you can type into it. Okay, the thing that is different is that the selection tool that you use up here no longer functions. As long as the grid is up, you cannot use it for selecting. The direct selection tool, yes, you can select individual anchor points even when you're in perspective. Now the selection tool is mostly, the duties for it are taken over by the perspective selection tool. Remember, there's two tools here. Okay, and so let me just start by drawing a shape on here, and you can see that it's working on the left side of the grid. That is due to the fact that our little widget up here is indicating the left side of the grid. Okay. Now that little widget is very important. When you want to draw on the right side, you have to click on the right side. Now you can see that it's operational. When you want to click on the ground, click here. Okay. This is going to take a little practice before you get used to it. If you're anything like me, it took me a while to kind of remember, oh yeah, if I want to draw on this side, I have to click on that side of the tool. If I want to draw on the ground, then I have to click there. And you'll notice that the colors adjust to the colors that are aligned with the colors that you see in your grid. Everything else sort of works the same. To get out of the grid has been a kind of a problem for some of you this semester. Let me give you the shortcut. It's Shift Command I. When you press Shift Command I, you're now back in the regular drawing. For instance, now my rectangle will draw true rectangles. Okay, so if you need to combine part of it in perspective and part of it out of perspective, you might say, it's Shift Command I. As soon as you click back into the grid, then it's going to function as a grid. Okay, all right. understand that the grid that you see here is just a suggestion. You can continue to draw anywhere on the, even outside of the artboard. Okay, you can draw over here, and you can see it responding to the grid. You can draw on the ground, and it draws outside of the grid. Okay, so the grid is not a restriction. It doesn't mean that you can't draw off of it. You can. It just means that it's going to constrain to that grid. For instance, if I, with the bottom selected here, and if I click over here and I decide I want to move this, notice that it moves while staying in perspective. If I want to move the panels that I just drew on the right, now they come and they conform to the grid on the right. Click here on the left, and they conform to the grid on the left. Okay, and you can do other things that we have learned about. For instance, I said that the white arrow will continue to work. It'll continue to work. You can select individual anchor points, and you can pull it out of square, and you can move it with the white arrow. Okay, there's no direct selection tool that substitutes for it. You use the same tool. This one, there is a substitute. You use the perspective selection tool. So if you want to move entire objects, you move them with this tool. Okay, the pen tool still functions the way you expect. If I want to add anchor points, if I want to minus anchor points, if I want to change the curve of anchor points, it still works that way. Hold the Option key down to turn corners into curves. Hold it, just click to turn curves back into corners. Okay, so that's all just the same as it was before. To delete from the selection, just click twice if you selected with the white arrow tool. Okay, ellipses work the same way, but they draw in perspective instead of drawing smooth, perfect ellipses like we expect. They change into perspective, and you can use that shift. I think I can. You can use that Option key to make duplicates. Let me try that again. Oh yeah, select, shift, Option, and you can make repeats with Command D. Just make sure that you use this tool instead of one of these tools for the initial move. Okay, so you can see how all that works. These are all white fills, that's the default, right? So I'll just change those so you can see a little bit more color in them. If I decide I want to move the whole cluster, I can move the whole cluster so long as I use the perspective selection tool, and I can move it down here. I can even use the Option key to make copies. I can do the same thing this way and make groups of copies. Okay, let's see. That's in a nutshell kind of how it works. I've got some examples of things I can show you here real quick. But basically, the thing to remember is that you move things with this. If you want, you can turn the grid off by using a perspective-friendly tool and clicking here. But I suggest, again, Shift-Command-I to help with that. All right, let me just open up a couple of perspective examples so you have something to give you some ideas of maybe things to draw. Here are some things that students have drawn. That's actually one of mine, just to practice. There's a 1-point perspective. There's a 3-point perspective. You can do pretty complete situations with buildings, with just with something with shapes. There's another kind of a interesting design. Now on this one, there's a second artboard, and some of the details were drawn flat. It's kind of like we did with the television set, and then brought over into this environment. And you can see that it changes it to perspective as soon as you get into the environment. Okay, type does work. Type does work with in this mode, I would suggest maybe that you go out of perspective mode and do your typing. You can do your typing on a separate artboard if you like, or you can do it right here. I'll use all caps. Okay. And I'll make it a little bigger. Hold the shift key down and change color just so you can see it a little better. Okay. Now, as soon as I switch the grid back on, depending on what side of the widget I've got selected here, and if I move it with this tool, as soon as it moves into the perspective environment, it changes to a perspective bit of type. And you can see that it also has changed to an outline of the type. So you got to make sure the spelling is correct before you bring it into this environment, or you'll be unable to edit it. Now notice that as I move it, it changes perspective. You can scale it. I would hold the shift key unless you need to stretch it for some reason. It'll stretch, but it makes it awfully hard to read. Okay, but type works. Okay, let's go back out to let's go back out and look at some more of those examples real quick. Here's a nice one done of a cereal package. Okay, you don't have to draw buildings. I know the grid suggests buildings. You can draw buildings. Notice on something like this, you can do perspective and signs that look like they're sticking out. You can add curves and such things. You can make things look really like they've got nice 3D qualities to them. Okay, just pick the opposite side of the widget as you go. Type. This one done with that blend mode. There's that thing again. Again, these details were done in advance and then brought into the perspective environment. Okay, you can draw behind. You can do all the different stuff that we've done in here. You don't have to do buildings. I know it does look like a building, and that's why so many people do buildings, but it doesn't have to be a building. Okay? All right, I'm going to stop there. Hopefully that's some help.